Welcome all of those who are joining us on our YouTube rather. You're at Eastminster United Church in Belleville, Ontario. This is the 4th of August, and it is a wonderful day indeed here. As we think about this summer and where we are, and I often think back of what's happened over the last few years, and as I was thinking about this sermon, thought about all the memories that we have, some that hurt and some that are wonderful. And I was thinking about 4.5 years ago, when the world was fascinated by events in the political arena in the United States. You might remember that. CNN had announced the biggest audience in their history for one night. What was that night? You probably guessed it was Barack Obama's election, the 44th president of his country. It was a unique moment in history. The world wondered whether the Americans would take that chance. It was a moment in history, and many of us have lived through a number of them. And often they are where people have gone out in spite of all kinds of issues and problems to line up for hours to ensure they vote for their candidate, to make sure that they catch a glimpse of what democracy might be like. Fewer people are willing to be just observers in these great moments of history. You want to be counted in your search for change and renewal. And people take to the streets, as we see all over the world today, trying to make a point, more than just a point, saying that change has to come, and they're prepared to be a part of that change. But what always strikes me as I watch historic moments, such as that U.S. election almost 5 years ago, there were the many moments of somber remembering back to the struggle that got people to that point. In this case, the struggle of black Americans to not only be free from slavery, but to be viewed as equal citizens in every way. I wonder, as we look at the world of television and read in the paper, how many of us would stand in line for many hours just to vote? The Americans, for all we might knock them, and Canadians like to feel somewhat superior in some ways, for all the knocks the American receives, they are passionate about their country. And in that election, they were clearly worried and wanted leadership change. This Sunday is the Simcoe Day weekend here in Ontario. And it's a time when we remember of looking back to the sacrifice of so many others. Others who have enabled us to become educated, to be housed, financially independent. It's important to remember and to keep alive the flame of hope that so many died and worked for to preserve our way of life. To me, this weekend is a reminder to all of us in Ontario of those who came early to this land, and through their efforts, their imagination and faith set the foundations of this great province. And it is a great province. Depending which newspaper you read, you may feel it's more or better, but it's a great province. Lord Simcoe represents the thousands who developed and established our society as we know it. And that sense of justice and the rights of others to enjoy the fruits of their labor remain foundational to our way of life. Perhaps you recall, and I'm sure you do, the story of Moses leading the people of Israel out of slavery into new land of freedom and independence. The interesting part of that story I always find is that Moses never got there. He died before they entered the land in which he was preparing them to enter all those years. He was the leader who, in the wilderness, had to keep the flame alive, that there was something better out there. We have to wait. We have to prepare ourselves for leadership within the promised land. And we all know that while they were in the wilderness, as we so often do, we groan about the time of the hardships and the toughness. Moses felt they needed to have a time to get that slavery sense behind them, so they're ready to take on the responsibility of freedom in the new land. In many ways, Barack Obama, as president-elect, reminded me a little bit of that story. Because after the conclusion of the Civil War during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, and if any of you saw the movie Lincoln, you'll understand this. The conclusion of that, African Americans had been technically made free. And yet we all know the story of their flight for equality in places like Selma, Montgomery, and Mississippi. and how a quiet, unassuming Rosa Parks lit the flame that could not be extinguished. It's interesting that through all that battle, there were Christians on both sides, Christians who felt there was nothing wrong with slavery, and those who did. All who proclaimed Jesus Christ as Lord, who were churchgoers, had a hard time recognizing the rights of all people. The Old Testament prophet Amos spoke words appropriate for the events we've seen and for each of us as we remind ourselves of the need to be diligent and vigilant in how we treat other people, and our need to be intentional in our thanks for those who fought for us, not only in previous wars, but through the hard struggles of the lives of our own ancestors. Amos states that God is sickened by the feasts and the burnt offerings made by God, to God, by the people who were trying to curry his favor. Not so much against what the action of people, but what was in their hearts, as we've spoken of before. What good are your words and your gifts when your hearts are hardened against one another? When you allow some people to be marginalized? When the poverty all around you no longer moves you to action? When you treat some people as second-class citizens and legislate to keep them oppressed? You remember this famous line of Amos that I've used before. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. It's a wonderful image for justice. Amos knew, as we instinctively know, that justice for all is an expectation of God, and we can't talk our way out of it. Let justice roll down like the waters. Images here of the power of water, and we've seen lots of that over the last year here. Cannot be resisted. Water covers all that's in its way. Amos knew that God wasn't one who just would pick and choose those who were to follow him. Amos knew that we all had to care about justice and love and civility. Amos had those insights thousands of years ago. The Old Testament prophet Ezekiel also gives us a wonderful image which we need to remember, which we read this morning. Ezekiel's dream, in which he believed God spoke to him. And in this dream, as we all know, God brings Ezekiel to a valley filled with dry bones, a valley of the dead. God points to it and asks Ezekiel this critical question: can these bones ever live again? And the natural answer, of course, was no. They cannot live again. But Ezekiel replies that only God knows the answer to the question of whether or not these bones can once again come together and experience life. This is a story that I always find very powerful, particularly when one gets discouraged, particularly as you read the paper, look at the magazines, watch television, but what's happening in the world all around us. We just get totally discouraged and say, will it never change? Will it never change? Is there no opportunity for change? Shouldn't we just give up? This is a great story. Ezekiel watches as the bones at God's command suddenly stir in a flurry of activity. The bones come together, and we know the rest of that story. But Ezekiel notes that in spite of all the activity and all the movement around him, there is no life. There's nothing but activity in the bones. And then, said Ezekiel, God breathes his spirit upon the bodies, and once again, the bodies stand up, a mighty host of the living. Ezekiel's message to his people who felt lost and alone and abandoned was that God is there. God does breathe new life into them. And once again, they will stand and be alive and free to live. Like the Israelites who were in the desert with Moses' leadership, wondering if they would ever come to the promised land. Some of them never made it. But Moses was trying to work with them that they must work for a better life for future generations as well as their own. Ezekiel says our God breathes new life through the giving of God's Spirit to us, the Spirit that's readily available for all of us if we invite God into our hearts. I've been in correspondence lately with a brilliant woman I have known since my early day of ministry in Vancouver. She's very successful, superb chief executive officer, a thoughtful person of faith within her synagogue. I've known her as a friend and a colleague, both as a board member and as a senior staff officer, working with her. She's someone who is fully committed to her work, possessed of a wonderful capacity to inspire staff and volunteers, and a woman whose accomplishments are without equal, from my point of view. She's been in correspondence with me as the deep pain she feels about the stand of the United Church, boycotting goods made in the Israeli settlements occupied on land taken from Palestine. As many Jewish people, she fights for the right of Israel not only to exist, but to flourish in peace and harmony with their Arab neighbors. Why, she says, does the church, particularly the United Church, concentrate on the many injustices that are there? Why do they not concentrate on the injustices within Canada, she asks? Why the need to be so harsh on a country that is trying to survive in a part of the world where democracy is almost unknown? And apart from the fact that three great faiths, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, have sprung from this area, and thus our natural concern for these birthplaces of our faith, should not our church, as others, concentrate more on the things around us, not just Israel? Issues of justice have been a focal point since the founding of our church in 1925, and before that in our three predecessors, Methodist, Presbyterian, and Congregational churches. I had gone through a chronology of issues led by our church which always spoke of equal need to work for faith and justice equally, as faith must lead to action. And many of these justice issues were unpopular and caused strain on our church people and our congregations. And I know I've mentioned that here before. But it's a time of remembering, it's a time to look back on what it is that our church has stood for and what it is that we have fought for and what are the prices that we have paid. I named just a few examples for her as we were in discussion from the last 80 years. Women in ministry ordained in the mid-30s, concern for the internment of Japanese Canadians in the Second World War, fight for the rights of citizens for relief in the Great Depression, sympathy for the women's suffragette movement, which led to voting rights for women here, pressure on Canadian government to be in dialogue with the poor and the oppressed in the world, rights of gay and lesbian persons to full participation in their community, and many other social justice and human rights to equality for all, regardless of gender, race, color, age, disability, or orientations. Today, our United Church continues, as in 1925, to stress that our faith has to go hand in hand with action, with justice and equality for all, and for peace. At no time has there ever been a guarantee that all of us will agree on the same thing. We're not a church that has insisted on agreement on everything. But we have a heritage of those who've gone before us who took very unpopular stands. Stands that cost them greatly as individuals and many times cost us as a church family. It is our heritage. It's part of our heritage. Committed men and women who were and are determined to create a better world, not only for ourselves and our children, but for the world community. That is, as we remember back, we think of those wonderful things that people did. We also have to read and look at some of the cost that people had in their lives. And I certainly can remember stories that my own family talked about in terms of some of the costs there were within our church and some of these issues came forward. We have a gentleman in this congregation, Ken, who was responsible, and Ken, I hope you don't mind my saying this, responsible for introducing the United Church new curriculum into Newfoundland and Labrador. Do you remember the new curriculum? A great and exciting thing. As I was thrilled with it, and a lot of ministers and people were excited about it, but many others were not. And it tore apart some of our churches. We often fight over things that we wonder, how important is it really? But that's part of the history of our church, to look together at what it is that God's calling us to do and to say in sometimes a very uncomfortable way, in an uncomfortable time. Ezekiel was really saying the same thing. God can bring you together, but the Spirit of God, when he's with it, it is then up to us to do something with that living body that has been created. And we are a living body. All of our discussions to this moment points us to what we're about this Sunday. The Sunday in midsummer, our time to refresh ourselves for the return of autumn with all of its busyness and expectations. We sing our songs of praise, but not as songs which mark ourselves for any special protection of God, but praise for a God who is with us as we fulfill our ministry together. We all know that memories can be happy and memories can be painful. For example, on Remembrance Day, while we're grateful for the sacrifice of those who went to war, we're sobered by the thought of those whose lives were radically changed when a loved one did not come home. Parents lost their sons and daughters. Men and women lost their wives and husbands. Children lost their fathers and mothers. Siblings lost their brothers and sisters. Sweethearts lost their chosen future mate. It's all humbling. Words are inadequate to express the gratitude and respect for the noble actions of others that I feel every day. All we can do is affirm that their sacrifices were not and will not be in vain. And so it is that we should remember with thanks all those who have gone before us in our country, our church denomination, and our families. Their example of fearless faith and determination to create a new land free from old prejudices, we must never allow to slip back to those old prejudices. Their example gives us courage to move unafraid into the issues before us as we continue their drive for a better society. God asks Ezekiel, can those dry bones ever live again? We know, as Ezekiel soon knew, that God can indeed make the dead rise and the dried out and the exhausted live again. He has done it for us. This is our faith. This is our conviction. This is our certainty. While memories can be hurtful, we know that memories are a reminder to us of what has been. And unless we remember, we cannot remain committed to ensuring what has gone on before us need not be repeated. And of course, we want to always ensure that the sacrifices of others and those who believed in us as individuals is not made in vain. And so we move into the second half of summer when we try hard to refresh ourselves for the return of the busyness. Let's enjoy this precious time of renewal, recreation, and remembering. It's a precious gift. I would ask you all to stand and repeat with me the creed of our church. It was written in the 60s. Please stand. It will be on the overhead in a moment. Or page 918 in the hymn book, if you're doing that. The creed of our church, which is a wonderful statement of what it is we believe. Not everything we believe in the United Church. We're not a church that have to follow something that's been written down. But this is a wonderful creed. And as we read it together, look at the verbs, for it is a creed of action, stating that the statement of faith calls us to a living with God in action. Not to be dry bones, but to be vibrant, living creatures in a hurting world. Shall we read it together? And shall we say it slowly and thoughtfully? We are not alone. We live in God's world. We believe in God, who has created and is creating, who has come in Jesus, the Word made flesh, to reconcile and make new, who works in us and others by the Spirit. We trust in God. We are called to be the church, to celebrate God's presence, to live with respect in creation, to love and to serve others, to seek justice and resist evil, to proclaim Jesus, crucified and risen, our judge and our hope. In life, in death, in life beyond death, God is with us. We are not alone. Thanks be to God.